Haunted strings need more to survive than just being played. Two worlds finally meet in the midst of a living nightmare. Her voice is her own. It is time to listen. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Mr. Mark had worked in instrument repair, sales, and lessons for his whole adult life. It was hard to make a living on this kind of work, so the rest of his life was checkered with odd jobs too, though most of them centered around music. He played in several bands, recorded for other bands, and wrote various jingles and songs that he sold for radio and television ads. He was an odd character. He was a short, thin, balding, middle-aged man. He had a large liver spot on the right side of his forehead, and he wore his pants nearly halfway to his armpits with his button-up shirt tucked neatly inside. He kept very quiet until people got to know him. Then, when he opened up, he would say the oddest things and had a very dry and bizarre sense of humor. Most people didn't get it, but it usually made Mark chuckle. His face was almost always expressionless, and because he was usually concentrating on delicate instrument repair jobs, people got the idea that he was a curmudgeonly grump. Other than being older and quiet, he never really did anything that he thought would give off that impression to people. But it brought him peace and quiet, so he was happy staying that way. This evening found Mark hunched over his workbench. He was currently resetting a new bridge on the violin of one of his customers. The old one had begun to warp, which made fine-tuning almost impossible for the musician. It was an easy fix. Just remove the strings and replace the bridge with a new one. Then he replaced the strings which held it in place by friction. He held the instrument up to his face and looked down his nose, through his spectacles, ensuring the bridge was lined up appropriately with the neck. He smiled. He always loved this view of orchestral instrument bridges. He thought of them as little wooden versions of the god Atlas represented in the musical world. When looked at from the face, they appeared to be squared-off little strong men, with their muscular arms flexed in and pumped toward their torso. On their strong, lean shoulders they carried the weight of the strings, the life of the instrument. Without them, the violins, violas, cellos, and basses were all useless. In the periphery of his vision he saw someone walk in the store through the front door, and he winced as he anticipated the door slamming closed. It didn't, though, and Mark looked over. The tall, thin, red-headed customer had turned and put his hand back to catch the door and close it slowly. He was wearing khaki pants and a long-sleeved denim shirt with pearl snaps, with a black leather Aussie cowboy hat to top it off. Same clothes he always wore. He was a regular customer, had been coming here for years now. He knew the door had a nasty habit of slamming closed behind people, and rattling the acoustic instruments on the walls so that they resonated with a residual hum. He had also chatted with Mark enough to know that he hated how the door slammed and jarred his concentration and disrupted his peace. Ever since Mark had shared that feeling with him, he had started closing the door quietly every time he came in. It was a thoughtful gesture, and though small, it meant a lot to Mark. The storekeeper didn't know this patron's name, even though they had been doing business for years together. Mark was really bad with names. He knew the kid went to Anoka Ramsey Community College, even knew his major. He studied journalism and was even the host of a show on the campus radio station where he would tell stories and do old-time radio dramas that some of his friends would write. He also had a band called Haunted Laundry, and when the kid had given him an album they put out one day, Mark decided to play it on the store's stereo system from time to time. He liked to support the independent music of his customers. He also knew every instrument this customer owned, and he knew them intimately. He remembered the fixes he had done to each one. He could see his handiwork over the years and could also see the age and wear on the instruments themselves. These were the ways he remembered his customers, not by their names. "Thank you for catching the door, stopping the slam, and leaving the breeze on the sidewalk." As usual, sir, you are a gentleman and a scholar, chimed Mark in his dry tone, yet eccentric manner of speaking. My pleasure, Mark. I was afraid the wind was going to catch it. It's really blowing out there today. Huge storm clouds heading in fast. I got a call that my mandolin was finished, said the patron. Yeah, I heard there might be a bit of thunder and lightning tonight. The guitars will be singing in a bit then. Your mandolin should be done here. Finished it up last night. Let's see. He turned and surveyed the rows of cased and uncased instruments shelved behind his workbench that extended down the left side of the store to the cashier counter halfway down the wall. Oh, no case for it, right? Nah, I never did get a case for that one. It's fine, though. Usually only leaves the house to come here, replied the customer. Mark placed the red mandolin on the counter to go over his work with the customer. See, I filed down the nut to lower your action a bit. It'll play a little more mellow and with less pressure and strain on your wrist and fingers. I also swapped out these 2 lower frets where you play a lot more. They were wearing out, and that's why you were getting that weird sound when you would play over there. The customer picked up the instrument and strummed a few chords in a short, bright melody that Mark recognized as the first violin portion from the beginning of St. Paul's Suite by Gustav Holst. God, every time, Mark. They always sound better after you work your magic. I have another project for you. Mark smiled. I saw that case on your back and figured. You know, you almost always have one instrument or another with me, right? No complaints. You keep me busy, just saying. What do you got this time? The customer set the case on the counter and opened it. Inside was a beautiful dobro guitar. It had a sunburst yellow pattern where the wood met the complex metalwork of the central body out to a dark edge. The neck was fat and squared off, and the strings were nearly a half-inch off the fretboard, meaning this dobro was meant to be played across the lap with a heavy steel slide. Mark eyeballed every inch of the instrument very quickly, looking for any imperfections that he might catch that could mean something, needing to be adjusted or causing a problem with sound. What needs doing on it? He asked. It rattles a little somewhere down by the bridge, and the lowest tuning peg has a stripped screw or something, so it just turns around without moving the post, answered the customer. Mark removed the dobro from the case, set it on the counter, and strummed it. The rattle was immediate. Something metal was resonating against something else metal, and it was a very unpleasant sound. I think we can trace it out for you. Otherwise happy with the tone and everything? Want me to just take a look and call you with anything else I might think of for it? Asked Mark. Sounds good, as usual. All righty. Mark looked up as Kirk, his only employee, walked into the store from the back room. Curtis, would you mind ringing this gentleman up for the repairs, and can you give him a case for his naked Mando here? Sure thing, Mark, replied Kirk before disappearing back into the back room of the shop. The customer thanked the repairman again for his work, brought his mandolin over to the cash register as Mark placed his cased dobro on the back shelves, and got back to work on the violin. Kirk quickly returned with a small soft case with a shoulder strap, tested it to fit the mandolin, which it did perfectly, and rang up the bill. I thought your name was Chet, said the customer. It's Kirk, actually. The old guy just likes to play jokes, said Kirk, glancing over at Mark, who was at his workbench, looking out of the corner of his eyes at Kirk with a sly grin on his face. He told the customer his total and took the cash from him, an even $20, the price of a general annual adjustment. Ha, that's funny. Don't I owe you for the case? Asked the patron. Mr. Mark said give you one. It's yours. You're in here all the time, Bob. Don't worry about it, Kirk responded with a smile. Wow, thanks again, guys. Thanks for the work, Mr. Mark. Take care. They said their goodbyes to the kid as he walked out the door with his mandolin in its new case slung over his shoulder. He turned and caught the door, slowly closing it so it wouldn't slam. He's a nice kid, said Kirk, turning to the workbench. He gathered his long brown hair in his hands to snare it into a ponytail. His face looked even more round when he did this. Because of this and the fact that he was always smoothly shaven, Mark would sometimes make fun of him for his baby face. He had on a black button-up t-shirt with flames on the hem and sleeves. It was untucked from his relaxed-fit jeans. A chain dangled low, running from one belt loop to his wallet in his back right pocket. "Yeah, he is. Gives us a lot of business. He must tell all his friends about us, too. That guy this morning mentioned his band, said he told him to come here." Mark stood up straight and stretched his back, turned to Kirk and straightened his glasses. "You all finished up with lessons?" "Yep," returned Kirk. "Then why don't you head out? I know you have practice tonight with the guys. I'm just putzing with this stuff. I can wrap up here. It was supposed to storm pretty bad, and the kids said it was looking like it too. I'd hate to have you driving in it if you don't need to." As if on cue, a flash lit up the evening light that had fallen across the parking lot outside. It was followed by a long drum roll of dull thunder that resonated lightly through the bodies of the acoustic guitars, banjos, and other instruments hung all down the wall on the other side of the store. "That's your exit music right there," said Mark with a grin and a wink. Then he went back to the violin on his workbench. He picked it up and began putting it back into its case. "All right, I won't fight you on it. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon. Good night, Mark." Mark absently waved at him as he grabbed his jacket from behind the counter and headed out the back door. Mark replaced the violin on the back shelves and made a note on his pad to call the owner the next day to let them know it was finished and ready for pickup. He pulled out another large case from the corner and removed a cello, which he heaved up and set gently on the counter. There was a split in the side of the frame and a broken tuning peg that needed repair. As he focused on the work, another flash of lightning and peal of thunder shook the store, his instruments singing out to him. Shadows and light danced in the periphery of his vision. Then the whole store began to sing with the beat of heavy driving raindrops on the roof and windows. It was clearly going to be a big late summer storm. He stood up from his work, stepped down from his platform work area, and crossed to the front door to lock it. He didn't anticipate any other customers with the bad weather. Then he turned off the storeroom lights, leaving the storeroom full of many strangely shaped shadows from the multitude of instruments on the walls and piles of amplifiers and cases in the center of the small rectangular room. He liked working in the direct beams of his work lamps with the rest of the place dark when he could. He preferred it because of the direct control it provided. He could place bright light and shadow where he pleased, allowing him to easily see as he performed this delicate work. Another flash of lightning lit the store, sending long, thin shadows from the many guitar necks dancing across the walls and ceiling. A sudden vision flared into his mind, of golden prairie grasses flowing in the strong winds of a summer thunderstorm. It was an odd thought. He returned to his work, hunched and busy. He was just going over the hole in the side of the instrument, trying to decide how he was going to work on that particular problem. Then he stood up straight for a moment to stretch out the ache in his back, when something across the store caught his eye. On the wall, where rows of guitars hung, there appeared to be an extra shadow. He blinked his eyes rapidly a few times and looked again. It was still there. The top row had 7 guitars, but as he quickly counted the shapes on the wall, he saw 8 shadows. A repeated projection of blocked light that was being cast by something that wasn't there. Another flash of lightning took them all away for a moment, and when the original light returned, the shadows appeared as they should. 7 guitars, 7 silhouetted necks on the wall. Mark furrowed his brow and cocked his head, counting them again. He shrugged and was about to return to the cello when another crash, this time from within the store, made him look up yet again. A stack of instrument cases had toppled over, falling toward his workbench and ending out of his sight below the edge. He leaned over the cello, placing his hands on the outer edge of the counter. He strained as far as he could to try to see the damage. As he leaned, a flash of blinding white light engulfed the entire room through the storefront windows, which was accompanied immediately by a roar of thunder as lightning struck directly in the parking lot in front of the store. It was so loud and so bright, he was deafened and blinded for a few seconds. As it reverberated, he heard the strings of the cello twang out below him, so strongly that he thought they had snapped. And as they did, he felt a twinge in his left shoulder. He was leaning too hard on it. As the stars and dancing lights began to leave his eyes, the twang in his shoulder rapidly increased into white-hot pain. His body reacted and tried to stand him straight up in a jerk, but he found himself pulled fast down to the workbench with an opposing pressure. He yelled out and winced as the pain shot through his arm. He was able to look down just in time to see that the strings of the cello had indeed come free of the instrument. They had also wrapped themselves around his upper arm and were already cutting deep into his flesh. Blood was pouring out around them. Another flare of lightning stole his vision and hearing from him. This time it wasn't the blinding light he had experienced the time before. He saw vividly the prairie grasses and a winding stream. A small stone bridge arched across it right in front of him. A grotesque and somewhat human silhouette was below it and seemed to be racing toward him. His arm was stretched out toward it and seemed to be pulled into it somehow. A dissonant chiming chord came to his ears. The bridge appeared to warp and curl. The entire image seemed to swirl with the arc of the bridge at its center, just as the water in a toilet bowl swirls down the drain. As the twisting and turning of this vision rapidly increased, he saw and felt as his arm was sliced completely through, just below the shoulder. As it did, he promptly fell back, striking the floor with a grunt because he had still been pulling away. He landed on his back behind his workbench. It all happened so fast. He never even had a moment to call for help. He stared at the ceiling as he quickly lost consciousness. But in his mind, as his vision grew black at the edges, all he saw before him were the swirling, churning black thunderheads moving quickly over a vast prairie sky. The call came early in the morning. Early for Eddie, anyway. Ellie probably would have answered, but she was in the bathroom. "It's been a long time, Edward. Do you know who we are?" the woman's voice asked. Eddie both did and didn't know. Their father had made some passing remarks about help from the suits or the slicks or the government. Never any detail, of course. Eddie may have even had foggy memories of a pair of suited figures talking to or getting yelled at by the old man. Back when he'd been less old and more man. Back when Eddie was small enough to hide behind his dad's leg. Back when he would have. Back when his father had been alive, and he'd been glad of it. That felt like such a distant, narrow window now. While Eddie's thoughts raced, the voice on the phone carried on. "Stay at the house. We'll be there shortly." "The house is, well, it's a real mess. This really isn't a good place to have," Eddie objected. "That doesn't matter, Edward. Our job includes providing support for your family. We should arrive in about 10 minutes. Ellie emerged as Eddie was hanging up the phone. Finding and answering it amid the clutter in the kitchen had been a trial in itself, and even though the old rotary device was now at the surface, it seemed to immediately begin to blend back in, camouflaging itself. "Who was that?" Ellie asked. Her hair was still wet. She never used a blow-dryer, despite having long enough hair to actually need it. Eddie was sure he could use a shower too, but wasn't about to start now if people were turning up soon. "The government, or the suits, or whatever else he used to call them, they're coming to talk to us." As Eddie answered, he felt a nip of shame and guilt. This dump was no place to receive anybody, and why had he even answered the phone? What was he even doing here? Ellie wound her way through the paths and began moving some piles in what had once been the living room. Beneath the years of disorder, they both remembered the square table. Too tall to be a coffee table and too short to eat from. That should be just the right awkward thing for whatever awkward meeting was sure to take place, Eddie thought. He both admired Ellie's disposition and didn't understand it at all. The piles, the junk, the chaos of the entire house was an affront to his tidy nature, but he hadn't been able to find it within himself to clean up any of his father's mess. The old man hadn't earned such a kindness, in life or afterward, at least not from him. "Did they say how many, or when they were coming?" Ellie said with a grunt, hoping to gently brush away whatever moping thoughts her brother was lost in this time. And if her heaving a clumsy bag around also managed to add a hint of, "Could you give me a hand with this?" to her question, so much the better. There were pockets of space suitable for setting down some of this junk, but even with a pretty high-level Tetrising, it would probably mean blocking off the path to either the basement or the study. The study was already clean, of course. They could find a few folding chairs and meet in there instead, but Ellie had grown very protective of that space, even when their father was living. Now she felt almost territorial about it, something she wasn't accustomed to at all. Despite that curious instinct, Ellie decided to block off the basement instead and began heaping things from the living room accordingly. "They'll be here in 10 minutes, Eddie said. "I didn't ask how many, but I think just 2. Ellie smiled to herself, both at their shared experiences in mysteriously knowing certain things and remembering her big brother when they were children. If he had information, the only way to get it out was to ask for each individual piece. It never seemed to dawn on him that somebody might want the whole story. What did they say? What did they want? What were they going to talk about? Sometimes it seemed like he honestly didn't remember things until somebody asked. Going off on his own, living in California, it seemed like he must have some capacity for planning and detail and initiative, but somehow it felt like he was always reacting instead of acting, except when he was, well, acting. Ellie smiled to herself a second time. Before she knew it, the doorbell rang. She had cleared off the cute little square table, and Eddie had even helped by exhuming enough chairs to surround it. The living room was hardly a picturesque way to visit over tea or the like, but it would do for some strangers barging in for some purpose she didn't know about. If Eddie knew, he hadn't said, but it didn't matter. They were about to find out anyway. It had been a long time since Mira had worked outside her office at all, let alone gone out to the family's home. And now it wasn't even truly that. The current generation of the bloodline still lived here, if in fact he still lived, but his daughter Gabriella and son Edward had moved out years ago. As Commander Mira and Agent Wilker had approached the door, she couldn't help but notice the stacks in the windows. That, combined with Edward's mention of the mess, had begun to prepare her to step into a certain amount of chaos. As always, it was her job to find order where possible and keep everything else in balance, all while using the lightest touch possible. When even the doorbell sounded muffled, she guessed that she may have her work cut out for her. A young woman answered the door. From memories of photographs, Mira could see that she had her grandfather Simon's eyes. Interestingly, she also had a similar, though smaller and subtler scar on her cheek. One thread of Mira's mind began speculating what sort of ritual might result in such a mark. Mira had never met Simon, but she knew all too well that both the family and her own agency had been closer to their prime in those days than they were now. Whichever agents had met whichever members of the family in the past, this was her job now. The door opened. "My name is Mira. You must be Gabriella," she said, extending her hand. "Mira, hi, and call me Ellie," she replied. The young woman's handshake was strong and quick, like her own. Though she was sure it was all in her head, Mira always felt as though there was some kind of forceful aura around members of the family. She hadn't seen this Ellie since she was a newborn, but she was no exception. The energy her father had, that they all must have had, was palpable. At least Ellie's energy didn't seem to have the defensive and confrontational acidity of her father's. "Ellie, of course, this is Wilker." Mira stopped herself from reflexively referring to the young man beside her using the title agent. Rank and file had their purpose, but titles were neither important nor helpful for a meeting like this. Words like commander or agent carried weight which could be good but could also be distracting. Any authority or leadership Mira had today would need to come by example. She would say what she meant and mean what she said. That reminded her to remove her sunglasses, and with a subtle nod she indicated to Wilker that he should do the same. Ellie showed the two in, and led them to what could best be described as a small clearing, which held some chairs and a square table that seemed to be missing the last 8 inches or so of its legs. Edward, now a grown man himself, was sitting down as he set a large and old-looking book on the table. Mira's mind wanted to spin up numerous lines of inquiry and conjecture at once about the mysterious tome, but she quieted such thoughts. Ellie made a polite joke about the mess in the house in her brother's fashion and asked if anybody wanted a glass of water. Nothing for me, thank you, Mira responded. Agent Wilker shook his head. Ellie sat, so Mira and Wilker followed suit. Mira introduced herself and her associate again for the benefit of Edward, who preferred to go by Eddie, though he did not say so himself. Whatever energy his sister was giving off, Eddie had also, but it was somehow more gray, more cloudy or guarded. Mira didn't see or hear any direct sign of their father. She would need to get to that point sooner than later. I'm sorry to begin with a question like this, but we need to know. Has your father passed? Perhaps her words were poorly chosen. Eddie only let out a soft snort, and Ellie looked down, but she did answer. Yes, he died just recently. Mira met the certainty with both dread and relief. It had been years since she had interacted with the man. In fact, it had been 11 years, a full macro cycle of the family's ritual, not that Mira was supposed to know that. So, you two are from the government? Ellie asked, wishing to change the subject. It was probably a very silly wish. Why else would these two be here if not her father? When Eddie had brought it up, she did remember her father mentioning people from the government helping somehow or other, but they didn't really seem the type. And if they were supposed to help, where had they been when he'd needed them most? He'd been in the hospital, so worried about all this containment and her that he'd insisted on leaving before his body was ready. Where were these people then? Something like that. What's important is that we provide support for your family, which we know has unique responsibilities, Mira answered. Ellie was of two minds whether to say another word to either of these two. Even besides the men in black look, it was pretty obvious these were not people who would share the whole story, and it was much harder in their case to chalk that up to forgetfulness or lack of initiative. Still, somehow, it felt like this was important and necessary. Ellie and Eddie were clearly caught in the current of something they didn't understand, and even a sketchy lifeline with ulterior motives was better than nothing. Judging by Eddie's face, he may not have agreed. Without meaning to, Ellie's glance must have expressed something along the lines of, "Say something," to Eddie's eyes. "Our grandfather taught him, and he said he needed to teach us. He took us to hidden," Eddie started but was cut off. "Before you go on, I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a division of duties that I'm afraid we're going to have to insist on following. There are several ways we can help you, but the ritual itself, your family rights, must stay strictly within your family. We cannot interfere, we cannot be involved, and by rights we cannot even know about your ritual." She kept saying "we," as if she'd bothered to explain who they were in anything but the most ambiguous terms. She spoke as if control was out of her hands, but so far the African-American guy hadn't said a word. Eddie didn't trust these two as far as he could throw them, so clamming up about all the family bullshit he'd tried to avoid his whole life anyway sounded just fine. Still, getting interrupted and lectured the moment he'd finally had something to say was more provocation than he could handle. He put it off until it was too late. He finally tried to teach us some ritual stuff and then he died while we watched. It was a complete nightmare, and I didn't even get along with him. We're not going to violate your separation of whatever because he failed to teach us anything important enough for you to refuse to know. Eddie immediately felt bad about his outburst, both for unloading on people who, for all he knew, were just good little bureaucrats just doing their job, and for Ellie, for whom this whole nightmare had to have been even harder since she did get along with him. By the time he'd drawn half a breath, he used it to punctuate his rant, simply adding, "Sorry," in a matter-of-fact tone to everybody and to nobody. The muffled sound of a clock chimed 9 or 10 times from an undisclosed location, and at a time that wasn't the top of any hour. "It's all right," Agent Wilker offered. "When I lost my father, well, I don't know your situation. We don't know. You're looking at two people in your house who don't know what you're dealing with. We're idiots. And sometimes idiots need to be yelled at." Eddie half sighed, half laughed, sniffed, and looked to his sister. The commander had asked Wilker to let her do most of the talking, but any time things started to go off the rails, his natural instinct was to lean in and keep things together. He wondered if Mira expected this kind of thing to happen. Wondered if this was exactly the reason she'd brought him along instead of someone more familiar with the family, or with the tech, or with any of this. It was almost funny how well she seemed to anticipate what would be needed and when, given how bad she was at the simple stuff like parsing jokes or gauging people's moods. Given how many moving parts she could keep track of at once, maybe there just wasn't room left in that big brain of hers for knowing how to calm a dude down. Ellie looked like she'd wanted to say something since before Eddie erupted. Wilker met her eyes and softened his expression even beyond his usual calm look. So if you can't know or talk about the ritual, which is what we need to learn, what... She stumbled over how to finish. Any number of questions were more than valid. What could they talk about? What help could they be? What were these two agents even doing here? Wilker hoped Mira had picked up on that and would begin answering without a specific question being asked. She had, and she did. Perhaps this would be a good time to go over the tools. We know you have need for some unusual kinds of equipment. We have at our disposal some technicians who are quite skilled creating implements without having to know fully how they will be used. Mira motioned to the case Wilker was carrying. It was time for show and tell. Mira had said to begin with one item in particular. Wilker pulled a roll out of the case and leaned over to put it on the corner of the table closest to Eddie. Ellie seemed to have a better grasp on things, but if he was going to figuratively or literally reach out to one of them, it was going to be the guy who was having a rough time. The guy who was pretty comically bad at being angry. Wilker knew it was a wick, but that was all he knew. He counted on Mira to do most of the talking, and sure enough she did. As he brought his hand down to set the wick on the square table, he was stopped a couple of inches short. He let go and pulled his hand back reflexively, and the roll of wick remained, floating motionlessly above the table. Mira was saying something about the filament it was woven from, apparently not surprised at all that the roll was now hovering, which it most certainly had not done in the lab. The two siblings looked at each other with expressions which Wilker was still too surprised to interpret. Eddie's eyes dropped right after meeting Ellie's. Fresh and already haunting memories flashed bright. Their father's lantern, now theirs, had shown them some kind of horrible and confusing truth about a neighborhood cat. He'd tried to light it down in the pit, probably hoping to see the truth there. The wick had been used up. A moment later he was dead, on fire and falling. His final words, "It's not your fault," never felt more hollow. Mira finished speaking her piece about the wick, adding that the family could get more as needed. After a slow, pained blink, Eddie grabbed it. Whatever it was used for must have been no picnic. Wilker had to quickly shake off his fixation with the weird hovering wick as he realized he was supposed to continue, bringing out the gear from the lab. He grabbed the pair of gyroscopic-looking weather vane things next. He realized several of these tools either didn't have names or nobody had bothered to tell him. He was introducing gadgets like Q from a James Bond movie, except his role was more like Vanna White. He set them on the square table, half expecting them to float as well, but their bases touched down onto the stained wooden surface. Jay's first solo project in the lab didn't seem to break the laws of physics. That was comforting. They were not heavy, but the batteries inside gave the conical bases some heft. Mira explained to the siblings what Agent Duncan had shown them earlier, that the light enclosures at the top looked a bit like gyroscopes, but were in fact three-dimensional wind vanes. The pair communicated by radio, constantly comparing measurements of wind speed and direction, as well as data from thermal and compass sensors. A green or red light on the base of each indicated whether or not everything matched. What anybody needed for such a pair of devices, Mira could only guess. The request had somehow been lost for some time, possibly years, and this set had only been completed last night. The sibling's father had at some point described what he needed to someone at the agency, but now it was too late to even find out whether this solution was suitable. Mira could tell nothing by the blank stares on the siblings' faces. Explaining the embarrassing lapse in development wouldn't help anybody, so she didn't bring it up. With any luck, these two would figure out how best to use these and the other tools. Well, it's a piece of the puzzle anyway. He'll solve it, no problem, Ellie said, nodding to her brother and turning one of the wind measurement gizmos in her hands. Ellie connected right away that they must have something to do with what her dad had expected to be some form of living wind. He'd called the living ground and living water the easy ones, and a living flame had fooled and killed him. That was the one which concerned her. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe the wind and whatever else was down there were even worse, but she'd seen the fire in action. She'd watched helpless as it killed her father and threw him away. And she had an important piece of that puzzle, too. The amber. Eddie had been given the spotlight but hadn't expected it and had nothing worth adding. Maybe he could at least save some face from earlier and not come off as a complete gibbering mess. She just means our father used to give me these sliding puzzle boxes. They're not part of the ritual, I don't think. Well, I got pretty quick at solving them. Not sure what that has to do with these, but there was or is something to do with wind. I'm not really sure what I can say and can't say. This is also messed up. Being put on the spot and having to beat around the bush when it came to subjects he didn't understand anyway somehow had not combined to produce eloquence. So much for not being a gibbering mess, Eddie mused. On the other hand, what did he care what these people thought, and why did he feel compelled to honor their don't talk about the ritual bullshit anyway? More importantly than any of that, he was worried about Ellie. She seemed distracted, even now, and had been since she found that nugget of amber. Eddie didn't know whether to believe her explanation. He had always assumed the scar on her face had come from their piece of shit father, same as his own scars, but there was something about her memories, the way she described looking through the amber, how she could see the fire of the sun, how she described what she'd smelled when her cheek had burned. Maybe she was right. Just because he couldn't remember anything from when he'd been that young, didn't mean she couldn't. And now these alleged government people were around to help. Maybe she had what she needed. Maybe he could get away from this place, and from all of this stuff that was making him crazy. He'd become so negative and so on edge. He was a better brother over long distance. Wilker brought out the next device, which looked to him all the world like an oversized baseball made out of metal. It was even split by a winding serpentine divide whose path was almost exactly like a baseball's stitch line. Half was a dim copper color, the other half plain and brighter. It seemed very light for a metallic sphere. It was so smooth, and even he fully expected it to roll off the table. It was an odd size and height, and there was no way it was level. The floor either. Not that there was much of anywhere to go in any given direction. Before he could find out for sure, Mira held her hand out. Wilker gave her the object and watched, same as Tupperware's children. Wilker couldn't help but smile at the silliness of calling the man who used to take care of the containment ritual Tupperware. The job was grisly sometimes, and weird fairly often, but silly only very rarely, so he decided to roll with it. He missed Mira's explanation, but saw what happened when she gave the ball a squeeze. Both halves turned themselves inside out and flew apart, like one of those slap bracelets. There was nothing inside, and there was no more inside for that matter. Each half flopped around as if made of stiff rubber. Mira touched the edges of both halves together, and in an instant they curled back into their combined spherical form, letting out a decisively solid metal clank. The two-toned ball was passed to Ellie, who tried squeezing either in the wrong place or too lightly. Eddie grabbed and tried, acting like they were siblings. That is, younger siblings. Wilker had no shortage of siblings himself, by blood and by choice. Earned family, he called those he grew closest to. His most recent brother, by choice, the other Jay, was now a part of all this. on Wilker's own recommendation. It felt like the right thing, and it let them be together again. He couldn't help but worry, though. Even back at HQ, even down in the lab, there was danger in this work. Still, as his father used to say about his own work as a cop, that's exactly why it was important. As she continued to introduce and describe the tools, Mira contemplated the lack of continuity falling on the shoulders of the family's new generation. She knew too well the danger of ignorance or simple mistakes made in their position. The last time she had seen their father, she had just become commander after containment was weakened. He was kicking himself over a mistaken ritual detail, something she'd been primed to learn but never did. She trusted that the family's rights were theirs alone for good reason, even if earlier on in her research role she'd allowed herself to bend those boundaries. But 11 years later, she wondered if he'd somehow made the same mistake, and what it might mean if containment couldn't be restored. It had come full circle. The off-limits nature of the family's ritual was once again a frustration to everybody involved. Mira only hoped that frustration was shared by 17 as well. Despite the novel objects being paraded out before her, Ellie found her thoughts circling the amber bauble, tucked away in its puzzle box in the study. Periodically, she forced her attention to return to the pair of suited people around the little square table in her childhood home. They had every appearance of salesmen, complete with a suitcase full of stuff even they doubted the utility of. But they truly were here to help, she had decided. The more they talked, the more things they showed, the less helpful they seemed. But oddly, that helped their credibility. It was a cynical kind of thought. More like something Eddie might say, but having worked through it herself left Ellie to realize that none of his cynicism came from nowhere. The final item out of the case was a cassette tape. This was recorded the night a fireball was seen rising out and away from Hidden Oaks Park, Mira said. Something told Ellie that the story of how these two had come by such a recording was as off-limits to her as details of the family's ritual were to them. But it didn't matter. As she looked at the transparent plastic case, as mundane an object as she'd seen all day, she could hear the crackling. She could feel the air being pushed by heat and motion, and smell the soot. She may not have known much more about her bloodline's ritual than those forbidden to know anything of it at all, but she knew that she had to confront the fire. Her father's corpse had illuminated something awful, something chained deep underground. And whatever its connection was to that living flame, she wasn't going to let it hurt anybody else. A business card was in Ellie's hand. "Thank you, we will," Eddie said. Everybody was standing up, and this surreal meeting, which had raised more questions than it had answered, appeared to be coming to an end. He'd have to talk with Ellie once the two were gone, but he suspected he knew the answer to his own question. She wasn't yet ready to deal with this on her own. She was by far the better of the two at playing host, but by the end of this visit, she was staring silently into space. And these people were allegedly on her side. He didn't like the idea, but at least for now, he had to be on her side too, and not just allegedly. Eddie shook their hands and finished their small talk. He'd worked up a kernel of appreciation for them, whoever they truly were, but appreciated them being gone even more. "Well, that went," he began to say, returning to his sister's side. He didn't know how to finish the thought. "I guess I don't know how it went, but it's over, so that's good." The two leaned back together and enjoyed the quiet. The messy, confusing, anxiety-riddled peace and quiet. The buried clock struck again, sounding as drained as the house's other inhabitants. Time hadn't stood still after all. The drive back to headquarters was not shaping up to be a talkative one. Wilker couldn't help but think of all the hours he'd logged in a similar black car with Agent Matson, who would never have let a solid minute of silence pass on his watch. Maybe he had some things in common with those siblings after all. The one who had been teaching him about how this side of the equation worked was gone now, and too soon. Whether or not he'd have ever thought of him as earned family, he lamented that he would never find out. He looked at Hidden Oaks Park as they drove by, and with each blink caught the same glimpse he always did when looking into those trees, ever since that awful day on reconnaissance. Tiny, momentary visions, just like blinking after a flash photograph, but delicate strands like fine white hairs instead of spots. "You did well today, Agent. I'm glad I took you along," the commander spoke as they drove away from the park. "Thanks, Commander." Mira must have been in a better mood than Wilker would have guessed. "I would certainly have loved to at least ask what that big weird book was," she pined. So that brain of hers was twisting Rubik's Cubes while juggling them, wondering about yet more bizarre reading material. That would put her in a good mood, all right. "I'm sure," Wilker answered. He hadn't even noticed any big book in particular among all the clutter in there. As he settled himself in for the rest of the ride, his hands met a lump in his pocket and took it out. "What the?" he started, staring at the roll of wick. "How on earth did you end up with that?" "Best to return it now, I suppose," Mira said, already looking for a place to turn around. Wilker seemed just as surprised as she was. He made some joke she didn't understand about it floating into his pocket, but it was hardly the strangest or most disturbing thing to happen while visiting the family. In fact, by those standards, today was a complete success. Maybe this containment business was going to keep working after all. Maybe her ultimate Plan B could remain safely in the realm of theory. Counting. I am counting. I'm using their units of time, the ones made by their ancestors. The calculations trickled in through every antique civilization, ground to dust by their greed, malice, and wildness. They think this is all that matters in the scheme of their petty lives. The rotating arms of a dial constantly following each other in a chase with no ending mark. For me, there is nothing left to do but wait. I have accumulated my extensions, pried them from their living hosts. I have sewn them, resurrected them, and rebuilt them into a worthy core for my sharp frame. Soon they will be together, a grisly unity, one luminary of their flesh. They would be proud if they knew. They would be honored if they knew that they gave them to me. Even the girl, the only death, her life was misery. The bugs showed me. I did her a favor. You're welcome, girl. You're welcome for pulling you out of the hell and into the world afterwards. They can sleep, my servants. They can rest now for these moments. They have been crawling over every inch of this city looking for my new pieces. They have done well. Even the wraiths have been productive, which is a surprise knowing how often they are caged. Simon's dead son would not have been strong enough to trap them. Simon would have been, but time got him. Time owned him, like all humans. Like it owns me, right at this very moment. As the limbs get their life again. Once I am out, I will be truly living again, not caged beneath the earth by some old forces that listen to dead songs and empty stories, who bend and kneel at the vaguest voices from their lost, begotten world. I will be free, and so will they. I will not hunt them. I will not kill them. They have been shackled like me, imprisoned by my imprisonment. They can keep their distance and keep their lives. It will be so unique to see the opalescent stars smeared across the sky with my own eyes and not those of my familiars. I want the breeze, the billow of branches, the trickling water, and the silver, still face of the moon. I can see it from my pit, but I do not see it truly. It is lackluster and muddled by the dead eyes of a cat, a bug or a phantom. Not my whole sight. Not my whole vantage point. Fragments only, roads that die by fading into the underbrush. Nothing can contend with my vision outside of this cage. I can see in every direction at once. I would have attained my part sooner, but I needed to deal with a volume of distractions, one being the human wandering these woods. A delirious individual who was lost in these stacked worlds. This person is a puzzle solver who does not have all the pieces. I appeared to them slightly, enough as I could manage in my prison, and they traded me for a gift that was not mine to give, so it does not matter to me if they should receive it. This forest has its own heartbeat and thoughts, a haunting echo of their apparatus and unity. They're welcome to be a mouse in this maze, lost and confused by its voids and limits. My languages deserve new audiences, not the same wandering soul chained to this smear of woods picked by my jailers. The flames are singing to me. I know they will be appearing the moment I throw aside these iron chains and doors. I can hear them in my cage. They are impatient, angry, and ready to tear apart the fabric of this reality. They have been out there on their own for so long, capturing things for when the moment is right. Every moment will be right soon. They will be legion. Patience is not only a virtue, but a state of being. I needed it for when I planned my escape. In my cell, layers upon layers beneath the earth, I pushed a dribble of blood out from myself and through an imperfection in the metal. It took decades to isolate those energies, to have that biological control. I let the blood sit in the dirt until a worm ate it, then the worm was mine. I wiggled it upwards until I breached the forest floor. I waved my body back and forth along until a sparrow got bold and ate me in 2 bites. And the sparrow was mine. Next, I needed something bigger, to summon them. I needed an anchor worthy of their shadows and grins, so I looked for a cat. There were none, though, or at least none willing to eat my body. I had to kill one myself using the sparrow's beak and my own cunning. It was still difficult. I wanted to forget. It is quite impossible to make a cat do anything that requires direction. Eventually, I willed the bird to peck at its eyes over and over again. This enraged the cat, and I lured the animal out to the road. I mocked it with this incessant violence till it was killed by one of their clumsy machines. I crawled into its dying mouth and forced my way down its throat. It was hard to mix and mold with a dead animal. A passerby stopped and threw the cat into the woods with a shovel. This was an unknown kindness to me. Out of the sun and away from the eyes of crows, I was able to focus more until the cat was mine. Then I used the stench of the dead to call to them, to summon them to my aid. Now they have done perfectly, and I am remade in my prison. The containment did not apply to their smiling shrouds of shadow. They were able to move freely within pit and prison, casually delivering their bloody gifts without notice from the hidden forces locking me here. I owe them my gratitude, but they have never asked for it. They are afraid of me. They should be. The cat was not my only plan for escape. To live life as long as I have, there must always be more than one plan. The bugs I called to were helpful, but not entirely honest. When I marked Aubrey with their scent, they were not resistant. But once she was dead, they grew disobedient, and I could no longer allow them to be my ally. The natural world has always had its own fickle sense of morality, so when they wanted back in after their little dream of goodness, I would not let them into the trees. They can run from me now until the end of time. It is not my concern, but theirs. I have higher goals. The ones whose limbs I have inherited, they speak to my skin and sinew in such mundane ways. Lives lived, dreams magnetized, then released. Happiness grabbed in small fashions. It all reeks of their kind's discontent with the magic around them. The rabid need to overdevelop, overestimate, and overcompensate for their mortality. Aubrey was the only one I can share some veins with, some songs to despair and humanity that still play on in my mind all these many years since walking beneath the dark bend of the bridge. Other than her, they are fingers on a hand, fixtures to my form that only bear the importance of utility. For them I must laugh at how distraught this maiming must have been, how life-changing for them in their limited existence, and for what? They will never know. Never. I have been here too long. I am curious to how my aura will interact with the moving world that is no longer fixed and forced to keep me prisoner. Even in all my minds and energies, I cannot judge where my shape will want to stop or start. I know there will be a storm, a vibrant green maelstrom mimicking the very greenery above me. The ants in their black shells screeching about the road will no doubt scatter when they see me. I do not need to hunt them to feel safe. They need to run to be safe. My only threat is Simon's brood, which has diminished mightily. The containment is broken. My body is almost ready. I can feel every vein pumping with my mystical blood. Soon I'll be ready. They wanted me. In all their stories, songs, and nightmares, they wanted me. They wanted something like me to be here. Now I am. Now I am almost free. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story Fretboard, written by Robert Dawn. The Square Table by Owen Swerkstrom. And She, written by Patrick W. Marsh. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. For more information on how to win your own Hidden Oaks wooden mug, visit us at hiddenoakspodcast.com for the rules of the contest. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening, and until next time.